You've decided to take the plunge. What plunge, you ask? To live with an EV on a daily basis. But unlike just a couple of years ago, there's a whole lot of choice. Now that's all fine and good, but you've got one small request. Unlike the kids today with these newfangled iPads on wheels, you want something more old world. So let's you and I start today's discussion with the definition of old world, at least as it pertains to electric vehicles. Now, as I see it, there are two definitions here. Definition number one could be any EV that looks like a car. You remember those. And then definition number two, believe it or not, any EV that is not a Tesla. So what we have here, both definitions apply. This is the Mercedes-Benz EQE SUV. We've driven a number of these. However, we haven't driven this one yet. This is the 350 Plus. This is the rear-wheel drive EV. Now, since you and I drove this thing about a year ago, they have made some changes here, at least in the US, as well as other markets. Biggest change, the battery used to be 90.6 kilowatt hours. Now it's 96 kilowatt hours. The range changes slightly. The US government says it now can go 307 miles on range. But this is where we get to the first point of living with a vehicle, and that's charge times. You and I have discussed this in many episodes. Basically, the Hyundais, the Kias, and the Porsches, and the Lucids are the fastest at charging because they have 800, or in the case of the Lucid, 900 volt architecture. These do not, at least yet, put a pin in that discussion. I believe Mercedes will be changing that, coming with the A-Class in 2025. But back to this one here. Let's say for the sake of discussion, I take this to a DC fast charger. It can support up to 170 kilowatts. Not so bad. But the problem is, where are you going to find a DC charger that can support that kind of speeds? The fastest I've gotten here in LA is about 150, and I got to 80% in about 40 minutes. Mercedes says 32 minutes. But really what's important is charging it here at my home charger. On other cars with similar sized batteries, I'm able to do that in 7 to 8 hours on my level 2 here. This one, 11 hours. Now let's be very clear about this. That's my specific situation on this specific grid here in Southern California with this very EQE. Your mileage, or really your charging times, may vary. Now before you and I jump behind the wheel, a favor, if you see value in these episodes, yes, would greatly appreciate you doing all the YouTube things, subscribe, notifications, leave a comment, but most importantly, share these episodes with your friends. Why? Well, you guys don't seem to like it when I call the algorithm the B word. But let's just say it won't change until you interact with it. This being a different kind of car, let's do something different and go to the belly of the beast. Not lightweight. 5,412 pounds, or depending on express your weights and measures, 2,454 kilograms. Now, what is it, 288 horsepower? But the torque on these things has always been high, even for the rear drive. And what does that really mean? Hammer down. From 50 to 70, there isn't a hell of a lot of passing power. That's the problem with the rear drive. But then there's the obvious question. Isn't there a huge difference between the acceleration of the rear drive and the all-wheel drive? There depends on the situation. So like if I'm trying to catch up with this Mercedes and this Tesla here, yeah, the all-wheel drive would definitely do more than this because it has so much more torque. But used as a city car, which is really what this thing is intended to be, not even really around here, around town, that's where between the all-wheel drive and the rear drive, they almost feel the same acceleration. So, reliability. This is an area, let's just say, complex cars can have challenging issues. The more complex the car, the more challenging the issue. This is one of those Mercedes that hasn't had that many problems since the car has been released. Now, going to my moles inside of car dealerships, Mercedes-Benz North America, as well as people I know that own these things and friends of friends, I found out a couple of issues and experienced one. There's the issue, believe it or not, with the headlights. There have been leaks in the headlights that have caused problems with the overall car. Now, from what I understand, this issue has been addressed through both the warranty as well as running changes at the factory. And for the avoidance of doubt, these are not manufactured in Germany. These are manufactured in what the Germans would call Tuscaloosa, Alabama. Now pressing on to the bigger problem, and that would be the software. When you think of any car that has all these screens in it, you're going to have iterations of software updates. This is the reality of life with iPads, computers, and now cars. But you can imagine Mercedes, BMW, old world car manufacturers not known for newfangled UX. Now, I will give a lot of credit to Mercedes. They have a subsidiary in Silicon Valley. That's all they do is UX, their research and development. So they're making changes quickly, so hat off to them. But the issue is this: you've got both the processor as well as the software that have to work in conjunction with each other in order to get speed. And the way to explain this issue is to tell you a story. I recently had to do some work in the hangar, so I borrowed a friend's 25-year-old Chevy pickup truck. And this issue slaps you across the face when you go back in time and drive that thing. You get in it, and there are knobs. You can turn on the fan, turn on the air conditioning immediately. Not the case here. You get in this thing, the MBUX, fancy, does all these things, and great for the kids that want screens, but it's very, very slow. Even with the updates, these are the issues that the dealers are seeing. So I'd say this is something that's just going to happen over time as they update the OS. Other than that, the only thing I would look out for with these types of vehicles, electric vehicles, these inherently are going to be more reliable because they have less moving parts. The only thing that I would shy away from or be concerned with if I'd want to keep a car like this past 5 years, adjustable dampers, especially air ride. When you get into those usually fail after about 100,000 miles, and in vehicles like this, it's about $4,000 a corner. So love it or hate it, this is what the EQE is all about. Sitting in the back seat, and no, it ain't a Maybach, but it's got the wheelbase, meaning the usable packaging space of almost an S-Class. An S-Class is a little bit longer, but what's different here from every other like gasoline-powered mid-size crossover, whether it's luxury or cheap seats, you have far less space back here because the wheelbase is shorter. So this isn't a function of me kind of gilding the lily and pushing the seat all the way up. This is where a 6-footer would sit, and the amount of space back here is almost ridiculous. There's a couple of things going on here. The shape of the seat's a bit different. It's a little bit more comfortable, if I'm honest. You know, I've said when we first drove these things, they're too much like a Lexus. They're too soft. Then there's the car we're sitting, the specific car. Stunning color on the outside. However, the inside, this is terrible. They call it black with sable. It's like an MB Tex, which I don't have a problem with like a faux suede here. The tactile feel is good, but it's a black cave. It's terrible on the inside. Now, why is this important? The design. You and I have discussed this in many EQS and EQE episodes. Basically, they've gone with this paradigm of screens everywhere. This one's the cheap seats, so it has the two smaller screens, and then there's that hyper screen, which is now fitted as standard to the EQE 500s in the US. But put aside the screens, the issue is when you have so many screens, no tactile inputs that you would get in a normal luxury car, and a lot of flat surfaces that don't have any texture, when you have too much black, too much gray, and only one splash of color, it doesn't do enough to make the interior stand out. Now, it's not all about the back seat. There are some packaging issues we have to discuss. Now, there's good news and there's bad news. Let's start with the bad news first. As you saw in many EQS and EQE episodes, there is no frunk. Even though this is an electric car, you have more packaging space in the back for storage, and they make good use of that. So yeah, you've got the suspension, it's independent multi-link in the back, and it's basically smaller, so it takes up less of a footprint in the overall packaging space of the vehicle, so there's more storage behind that to increase the overall storage capacity of the entire car. So you and I have arrived at that point, to the point at which we need to discuss money. Here there's good news and then there's challenging news. Let's start with the good news. We drove this for the first time about a year ago, just outside of Lisboa. Car looks just like this. It was the same color, but it was a 500, so all-wheel drive, more power, more torque. And then I asked the folks at both Mercedes-Benz AG as well as Mercedes-Benz North America, can I have the pricing? And I said, sure. They give me the pricing. And I had to confirm it was like 3 people, because whether it was this, the 350 plus rear-wheel drive, or the 350 4MATIC all-wheel drive, it was the same, $77,900. Now, I've been doing this for a long time, and I don't know any car manufacturer that throws in a whole second electric motor for free. Now, that brings us to the obvious question, how much is this specific one? Well, it doesn't have a hell of a lot of options, biggest one being the 10 degrees of rear wheel steering. That's $1,300 extra. Then we add the various and sundry other bits, as well as the destination, Von Vance, Alabama, and it comes in at just under 87,000 US. Put another way, that's like 20 grand more than a somewhat moderately equipped GLE, on which this is trying to be the EV version. But that brings us to the more challenging news. Competition from unlikely sources. Now, you are most likely looking at this picture thinking, I have completely lost my mind because Kias, they don't compete with Mercedes. Well, in the EV world, they kind of do. As a matter of fact, this one's only $7,000 cheaper than the Mercedes. And that's not the only example. Cadillac, something with sort of a badge, they too have an electric 2-row crossover, but base price to base price, the delta is $14,000 less. Okay, so let's file all of that under the heading of newfangled opportunity cost, because the realities are this. People who are looking for an EV have very different priorities than the people that are looking for an internal combustion engine vehicle. And from what I'm seeing, badge, not a very big deal. In fact, it kind of works against them. That brings us to the realities of what are people paying for these things? And here we get into a topic you guys know I don't like discussing, and that is leasing and debt. I am not a fan of these things. Those of you who don't know this about me, there are many episodes you can check out where I pontificate about that topic. However, the majority of these things, meaning the Mercedes EQEs and probably these two, are leased, more so than the percentage of Range Rovers and Jaguars that are leased. Okay, getting off my soapbox, the market, they had a hard time warming up to the EQ series. Not just E's, EQEs, EQSs, SUVs, sedans. So Mercedes, they got very aggressive in marketing these things via leases. And up until last year, one was able to get a lease on an EQE SUV 13 months for like $550, $570 a month, something like that. Crazy kind of deal. Now they've changed the incentives. They're at somewhere between $700 and $800 a month, depending on whether it's all-wheel drive or rear drive, which I think is funny. The base price is the same between the two, but the lease incentives are different, whether it's all-wheel drive, rear drive, and it basically tells me there's less demand for the rear drive. So longtime viewers of the show will remember this, my old neighborhood, the Venice Canals. Perfect application for this, a city vehicle. We're amongst a number of canals here. This is what Venice used to be. They used to call it Venice because it was swampland. So let's go to the end of the canal here, and let's see if we can do a U-turn with our 10 degree of rear wheel steering. So, now the neighborhood really hasn't changed since I have left. Granted, it's a bit of a tougher neighborhood now, but it really hasn't changed. So there we go. 10 degrees of rear wheel steering. Have we made it completely? Hey, that's close, that's close, that's close. Amazing, we cleared the whole thing. So let's take stock. This is an alleyway, and I'm able to do a complete 360. You wouldn't be able to do that with an X5 or a 5 Series, which would definitely be a direct competitor of this. So what have you and I learned today? Well, something you and I normally don't experience, and that is a complex car, aside from a couple of early bugs that had to be ironed out, that is relatively reliable. Now, this is something that frankly you and I should expect from EVs because there are less moving parts, but it's good to see it in practice, and it's good to see that the old world is addressing some of the new world and updating as they go. That brings us to the wish list here. In what we've learned now driving many of these EQs, whether it's the E or the S size, they don't drive like Mercedes. Now, to some people, they might love this. Like, I think this is an incredibly good city car, probably one of the best city cars I've driven as of late. But it's 80 grand. That's a lot of money for a city car. So if I'm reading the tea leaves correctly, what I'm asking for, the next generation of Mercedes-Benz EVs, yes, 800 volt architecture, I need this to charge faster. Maybe you could leapfrog 800. I'll make it up. How about 1200 volt architecture? But most importantly, let's make it drive like a Mercedes. Now, why do I make such an emphatic request? Well, the car that I had to hand in to get this, that's why. What was that? A Mercedes GLS, specifically a Maybach GLS. And that reinforces everything you and I have known about the way a Mercedes-Benz drives. They're very specific, whether at low speeds or high speeds, and that one in particular is the best large SUV out there to drive. How about sharing some of that goodness with this, even though I know you're trying to reinterpret yourself for EV? But I'm just one man, and this is the point of the episode. I turn around to you guys to opine in the comments below or via our social media, MotoManTV, all one word, MotoManTV, all one word, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Now, if you got value out of this episode or found this format fascinating, I would highly suggest you watch another one in our Living With series. How about this one, a plug-in hybrid, maybe a Porsche? You can check out that episode here. Until I see you in the next episode, bis später.